Welcome to USC Rossier's Leadership Month and today's webinar, Lunch with Leaders, Higher Education Leaders. Before we begin, I would like to review the process for submitting a question for our panelists. Please type your question in the Q&A box that can be accessed by clicking on the Q&A icon located at the bottom of your screen. We have reserved time towards the end of the webinar for your questions and hope to get to as many as possible. We also received a number of questions via the registration form and have tried to incorporate as many of them as possible into our structured Q&A at the beginning of the session. If you are planning to share your experience at today's sessions on social media, we encourage you to include the Leadership Month hashtag #RossierLeads, which appears at the bottom of the screen. Lastly, please note a recording of this webinar will be available in the next few days. A link will be sent via email. And now I would like to introduce our moderator. Tracy Tambascia earned her EdD from USC Rossier in 2007 and currently serves as Professor of Clinical Education at USC Rossier. At this point, I will turn the program over to you, Tracy.
Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. Welcome to our participants who are joining us online. I'm also very excited to introduce to you the panelists for today. And I'm going to give you a brief introduction, and then they're going to tell you more about themselves. So we'll start with Bridget Collier. She's Associate Provost for Equal Opportunity Programs and Title IX Coordinator at the University of Chicago. We also have Mmeje, who's Vice President for Student Affairs at Southern Methodist University. Welcome, Casey. And Rameen Talesh, my good colleague and longtime friend, Assistant Vice Chancellor of Student Life and Leadership and Dean of Students at University of California, Irvine. Rameen, I think you have the longest title, so you get that prize today. So what we're going to do is I'd like for you each to introduce yourselves. Tell us a little bit about your career path and also tell us where you currently work and what you do there. And we're going to go in order just to make this really smooth. We're going to start with Casey and then Bridget and then Rameen. So I'm going to turn it over to Casey.
Great. Thanks, Tracy. To our audience, thanks for joining us this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Again, my name is Casey Mmeje. I currently serve as the Vice President for Student Affairs at SMU, as Tracy noted. My career in student affairs, I would say, started primarily at my undergraduate experience. I did my undergraduate work at the University of California at Santa Barbara. And like many people in this field, I didn't grow up thinking that I wanted to be a vice president for student affairs. I sort of happened onto this career path. I'm a first-generation college student, and so found myself at UCSB, a predominantly white campus. And like many first-generation college students do, I experienced tremendous hardship early on in my collegiate experience. And were it not for good fortune that I had phenomenal student affairs professionals that took me under their wing, mentored me, and helped me navigate my path, that's kind of what got me open to the idea of pursuing a career path in student affairs. I started my career at the University of Vermont. That's where I did my master's work. And took my first professional job right out of grad school at the university, serving as the Assistant Director in Student Judicial Affairs. So I grew up in the conduct realm, if you will. Conduct was my entry point into higher ed. I worked at UVM for a couple of years, adjudicating primarily low to moderate level cases, focusing exclusively at that point on student behavior. Served in that role for about 1.5 years and got tired of being on the East Coast and so far away from family, and moved back to Southern California and landed at USC at that point. I started at USC as the Assistant Director of Student Judicial Affairs, doing similar work, but in addition to adjudicating alleged misconduct, I had the responsibility of managing academic integrity violations as well. And so that gave me an opportunity to work very closely with faculty, and broaden my understanding of the way that academic affairs works on a college campus. I transitioned, well, I should back up and say while at USC, I served in a number of roles. I had the opportunity also to work in our Vice President for Student Affairs office as a Special Projects Coordinator. And that position really gave me an opportunity to gain a broader understanding of student affairs more globally, and understand how student affairs interacts with various stakeholder groups across campus. In addition to serving in the VP for Student Affairs Office, I also worked as the director of a grant-funded program that provided access to higher education for first-generation and low-income students that were transferring from community colleges to selective four-year universities. So served in that capacity for about 4 years, and then I transitioned to Loyola University Chicago, where I worked there for a total of 7 years, overseeing a lot of student life functions, student activities, Greek life, leadership programs, the student union. I was ultimately promoted to the Dean of Students role in that, at that institution, and had responsibility for conduct, Title IX, behavioral concerns, and threat assessment. I came to SMU about 3 years ago. In fact, next Friday will be my 3-year anniversary for serving as the VP for Student Affairs at SMU, where I'm the Chief Student Affairs Officer and primarily responsible for the delivery of a lot of our support services that sustain and engage our students when they're not directly in class.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Casey. Bridget.
Sure.
Thank you, Tracy, and welcome everyone to this conversation. I'm very privileged to be here with you today, and I've enjoyed the past week really reflecting on the arc of my career and what brings me here today. Similar to Casey, I was very shaped by my experience as an undergraduate student at Ball State University. It was the first time that I really became engaged as a student. I was not a very involved student in high school, and my RA, Carrie Alioto, I still remember her today. She played a very important role in my life and the trajectory of my career. She got me involved in my residence hall community, and I then spent over 14 years working in residential life, first as a student and then as a professional staff member. So I have the notable highlight of my career. I've spent over 12 years in live-on professional roles, really immersing in student life and culture. And I think that gives me great insight to the campus community and the engagement of the campus community. So I spent 4 years at Northern Arizona University as a residence hall director. As I worked full-time, I also pursued my master's degree in counseling and student affairs. And from there, I went on to UCLA, our crosstown rival, and spent 6 more years as a resident director. What I really appreciate about my time in housing and residence life, I really feel like I gained such a broad skill set and developed such a great mindset around community and concepts of community. So it was a great training ground for me. I had the opportunity while at UCLA to pursue my doctorate at USC. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. Following my doctoral program, I took a personal leave from UCLA and had the opportunity to sail on semester at sea as a staff member. And that gave me a chance to decompress from working full-time, being in school, and really think about what my next move was. And as with career, our lives influence our careers. I happened to meet my spouse when I came back and ended up moving to the University of Washington at Tacoma. He was in the military, in the Army, and he was stationed at Fort Lewis. And so I got married, moved up to Tacoma, where I served as the Associate Director for Student Planning and Administration. So it was my first role outside of housing. I felt a little bit out of my element, not having the natural cohort of housing professionals around me. My role was very broad. I oversaw strategic planning and assessment initiatives for the Division of Student Affairs. And from there, I had my first child, my son, and again, life intersects with career, and we chose to move home, for me, home, which is the Chicago area. We live in Northwest Indiana now, which is literally coming back home for me, a homecoming. So I took a position at Roosevelt University as the Assistant Vice President for Residential Life. I was at Roosevelt for 3 years. And during that time, I had 4 different roles. So this was around the time, not long after 2008 and the Great Crisis. At that time, institutions really underwent transformational change. And so my job changed with it. And so I served in residence life and then broader roles within student affairs at Roosevelt. And then my final job there was Chief of Staff to the President, Assistant Secretary to the Board of Trustees, Director for Change Management, and Title IX Coordinator. So I had a title that would rival Rameen's, 4 different job titles at Roosevelt. That really gave me a lot of reflection on what I wanted to do next. And for me, it was going back to a student-facing position. So that's when I moved to the University of Chicago as a Dean of Students for the Graham School, which is the liberal education arm and executive education arm. So I had students aged 14 to 102 that I served. And I was in that role about 1.5 years before I was asked to move over into the Title IX position where I currently am. And so my role now is Associate Provost for Equal Opportunity Programs. And in this capacity, I am the Title IX Coordinator as well as the ADA 504 Coordinator and the Affirmative Action Officer for the university. So I report to President Zimmer and Provost Kai Lee and have the unique opportunity to be in a position at an institution where concepts of freedom of expression are taken very seriously. We have the Chicago Principles, and then the space between, as I call it, with issues of discrimination and harassment and the impact that speech can have. So I have a unique opportunity to have those conversations with our students, our staff, our faculty, our president, and it's really an important position and something that I take very seriously, and I'm very proud to be in this position.
Thank you so much, Bridget. And just in case there's any question, just know that we still love you, even though that you have some Bruin in your roots, you know, some UCLA time, we still do love you.
So my loyalty and my donations go to USC. So
that's what we want to hear. Thank you. Rameen.
Well, you know, as a UC employee, I find that that's all right. My name is Rameen Talesh. I'm the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Student Life and Leadership, Dean of Students, as Tracy mentioned. I'm a Southern California product, public school product here locally. I went to UC Irvine for my undergraduate degree in political science and minoring in history, and got involved in a lot of different things, as mentioned by some of my fellow panelists, and fell into student affairs. I actually lined up my job at UC Riverside as a resident director prior to getting any master's degree or anything like that. So it was a long time ago, before that was kind of the norm. And I was a resident director at UC Riverside for 1 year. After that, I moved over to Cal State Northridge. So I had a chance to be in the Cal State system here locally, and worked in apartment style residence life arrangements for 1.5 years, and then moved over to campus activities. And there I worked with student government advisement here and there, fraternity life advisement, campus organization, and ran campus organizations over there, advisement, as well as commencement orientation. We did a lot of different things in the office in general. And so it was a good time to kind of dabble in a lot of different things. During that time, I also got my master's degree in public administration. So I kind of went a different route in terms of my master's degree, partly because I was still not quite sure what I wanted to do forever. And, you know, and I thought public administration might give me a little flexibility if I wanted to do work in the public sector. After that, I got a job at UC Irvine in Arroyo Vista Housing, which is small group housing, basically. It's like a village almost. And it was made up of fraternity and sorority houses as well as academic theme houses. So it kind of blended some of my experiences in a residence life format. And so there I spent 5 years in that role. It gave me a chance to supervise staff. It gave me a chance to have increase in budget. So it gave me some of the managerial skills and tools that I would need later on. And then after that, I applied for and got the Director of Residence and Greek Life job at Occidental College, and later evolved into an Associate Dean of Students job there. And again, at a small private liberal arts college in Los Angeles that Occidental is, you do a lot of different things, you wear a lot of different hats. And so you kind of dabble in a lot of different areas. And so that was my experience there. It gave me a different institution, a private school, a small one. A lot of wonderful experiences there for the most part, and learned a lot of things along the way. After that, and during that time is when I entered my USC program for my doctorate, actually. I finished it while I had transitioned over back to UC Irvine. I came back to UC Irvine in 2006 as a director of one of the big housing complexes, Middle Earth Housing. but quickly transitioned into an associate dean of students role. And then later on in 2010 was appointed as the dean of students. And so I've been the dean of students there since that time. Finished up my EdD program in 2007 with Tracy. And then also during this time period, I was a dean of student life on semester at sea in fall of 14. I'm actually slated to be the executive dean in fall of 21. We'll see how that goes. So that's in flux maybe, but I'm looking forward to that if it actually pans out. And I have 3 adult sons. I guess adults in the eyes of the law. Maybe with me, you know, still a little work to be done. But you know, that's the situation. So, you know, having a family and raising family and during that time period as well. I do teach a little bit at USC in the PASA program and EdD program as an adjunct faculty member, off and on, depending on my workload, new experiences I'm having, and if I have the time to give. And I'd like to do it just as a great thing to do, and actually keeps me fresh and keeps me in tune with what student issues are, et cetera. In my current role, I oversee about 16 units, some large, some small. 2 units I've just inherited as of July 1, student government and student media, which is a big one on our campus. It's a $10 million operation. Sustainability Resource Center has also come on board, student life and leadership. But the remaining balance of student life and leadership is made up of some compliance offices, International Center, academic integrity, student conduct. We have a Veteran Services Center, which does the certifications as well for veterans. We have a number of cultural or identity resource centers that are under our wing, our Cross-Cultural Center, our LGBT Resource Center, our Dream Center, our Center for Black Cultures, Resources and Research, et cetera. We also have kind of your traditional student life operations, orientation, student clubs and organizations, sorority, fraternity life, et cetera. I'm the #1 person that gets called out for like protest management situations. You know, I sit on our bias response team. I sit on our behavioral intervention teams. Do a lot of, you know, obviously I have a scope that's pretty wide. So I'm a generalist, I think, in my role, certainly. And probably my colleagues are in some way as well in their current roles. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Rameen. You know, listening to your backgrounds and your bios, it occurs to me that somehow Casey and I are missing out on the semester at sea thing. So I think we're going to have to touch base offline and figure out how we can get on some of those ships, because that sounds like it would be fun.
It does.
Right?
Rameen might be hiring for 2020.
2020. I know. I made note of that for sure. Thank you.
Okay, I'm taking folks that their voyages have been canceled and they're jumping.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Okay.
So panelists, we're going to transition, and I actually, in listening to your backgrounds and bios, I have some more specific questions for each of you. So we're going to start with Bridget. Bridget, you have this really amazing traditional higher ed background, you know, working in res ed for a number of years, but it also sounds like at certain points in your careers, you have taken on these roles that have been much more broad across the university. So I'm wondering if you could, I know you talked about 2008 and the crisis that universities were facing, how that was also a transition point. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how you made those transitions. And for others who are thinking about that, what should they consider?
That's a great question. And, you know, when I look back at it, I really see that there were individuals who influenced me in many different aspects of my career trajectory. I really like how Sheryl Sandberg talks about careers being jungle gyms and not necessarily ladders anymore, that you can find yourself taking a step to the side or going in a different direction than what you expected. Certainly, I thought that I was on a VPSA, a student affairs trajectory for my career, and for the most part, I was. And it was really at Roosevelt that I took the first step in a different direction. I was asked to serve as the chief of staff to the president. He was in his final year, so we also conducted a presidential search that year. And I think it was just the role that I had played in the community and in the staff community. I think there was a level of credibility that I held with the staff community, and so it wasn't necessarily an application so much as a request to serve. And I'll certainly always serve at the request of the president of my university. And it was really there are times where I felt uncomfortable. It was a risk in many ways. The Board of Trustees operate very differently than residential life programs. And so I really looked at it as an opportunity to learn and to grow in terms of my skill set, my understanding of how an institution works. And at the end of the day, what I think is that I now look back and I talk about it from, I call it Dr. B's 5 Ps. So when I think of my career, I think of 5 Ps, 5 principles that I can apply, that as a higher education leader, I oversee people, I oversee programs, I oversee policies, procedures, and I participate in the politics. And so that's Dr. B's 5 Ps that at this point in my career, because of the experiences that I had, because of the nudges that I've been given to do different things in my career, I'm again in a position where I was asked to come and serve in this role, and took up the request, and again found myself in a position where I wasn't entirely comfortable. You know, I had a lot of questions about what I was being asked to take on. And then I framed it in my mind from that 5 Ps, that you can take any content area or any experience in higher education, apply those 5 principles of leadership and management, and really commit to making yourself successful in those areas.
Thank you, Bridget. There's a lot of what you just said that was really important, but I want to sort of highlight this concept of a little bit of fear. There's a little bit of fear when we're asked to step outside our traditional roles. And it sounds like it took some courage. And also the ability to accept ambiguity. It sounds like there are a lot of questions around your transitions, but you went with it and you managed and you asked questions to make it work.
I also called a mentor. I called Dr. Mike Diamond, Professor Emeriti of the Marshall Business School, and he was on my dissertation committee and continues to be an important part of my life. And I check in with him often, and I called him and said, what do you think? You know, what do you think about the role? And what do you think about me in this role? And it was so helpful to process through with him. And I think at the end of the day, had I not had him as an anchor and someone who had known me in my career, I'm not sure if I would have had the confidence to step into the role. So he played an important part.
Thank you. And Bridget, you queued it up perfectly for me, because my next question is about mentorship. And I want to talk with Casey about that. So Casey, I know that throughout your career and in your current role that you are a mentor to others, but I'd like to hear from you about mentors that you've had, not specifically by name, but how you established relationships with them and how they also helped you develop your career and also made decisions in your professional life.
Great, thank you, Tracy. And I'll certainly echo a lot of what Bridget shared regarding just the importance of mentorship throughout my professional journey. I can say confidently that I would not be the professional that I am today. I wouldn't be where I am today professionally were it not for the mentors that I've had in my life up until this point. And I was really introduced to mentorship, particularly professional mentorship, early on in my career by virtue of my involvement with NASPA and what was then called the MUF program. It's now the NUF program. And I'm an alum of that program, and that's an identity that I hold very near and dear to my heart. But one of the core elements of that program is a campus-based mentoring relationship with a senior student affairs professional. And as a senior in undergrad, I had the privilege of having a mentoring relationship with our Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs. And that proved to be a very transformative relationship for me. By virtue of the program, our mentoring relationship was highly structured. So I met with our Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs on a bi-weekly basis and had the opportunity to talk with him about a host of issues pertaining to my professional interest and just how he was able to get to the point of being a Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs. And that was incredibly eye-opening for me. That relationship blossomed into a personal friendship and really served as the bedrock for my professional career. And it reminded me of the importance of seeking out mentorship at all stages in my career. So I've always been very intentional about identifying professionals, whether they be on my campus or individuals that I've had the pleasure of meeting through professional affiliations, to identify individuals who can serve as mentors for me. And you know, that required very intentional and active effort on my part to not only identify those individuals, but then to approach them and have what at times is an awkward initial conversation about inviting them to serve as a mentor or articulating to them my desire to be mentored, and I explaining that I believe that they have something to offer that I could benefit from. And I've been very fortunate at every turn in my career to have people who are willing to avail themselves of that opportunity and pour into me as a professional. And those relationships have evolved over the years, and they are now many of my dearest and closest friends in the field. And I leverage their expertise, their wisdom as often as I can. And some examples of that are certainly at every stage of my career where I've considered a professional transition, I've been able to call on these individuals to invite their input, their advice about the position that I'm considering and what it might mean for my long-term professional trajectory and career path. And so their counsel, their advice has been incredibly influential and helpful to me throughout my career. Also, even on the day-to-day matters, you know, if I'm dealing with an incredibly difficult situation at work, you know, I'm always comforted knowing that I have a cadre of professionals who have been through this before, who have tremendous amounts of knowledge and wisdom that I can tap into. And so I rely on them when I'm faced with difficult situations. COVID-19 being a perfect example, you know, I call on my mentors and bounce ideas off of them and invite their feedback. And I'm really fortunate that those relationships have developed to the point where it's quite natural now. They don't feel like formal mentoring relationships. They are truly friendships, as Bridget described hers with Dr. Diamond. I mean, these are people that are just friends, you know, and have played an incredible role in my professional career and journey. And those relationships have been incredibly profound and transformative, and they've inspired me to try and give back to future generations and the next generation of student affairs professionals. And so because of their impact on my life, I've made it a point to find new professionals that I can mentor, whether that be through formal programs, through NASPA, and knowledge communities, or professionals on my campus. It's incredibly important that we take the time to cultivate those relationships, you know, because they are incredibly helpful and meaningful. They help us grow as professionals. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Casey. You know, I'm also a first-generation college student. So when you're talking about the awkwardness of reaching out to a mentor and like trying to ask, you know, will you help me? You know, that really resonated with me. And I wonder if you have just one tip, like, do you have one idea that you can offer others on how to negotiate that first awkward conversation?
Sure. So I would say, again, I think being very intentional about what you are hoping to gain from this individual, being to the extent that you can, being very explicit about what it is you're asking for. You know, I think that's one of the things that new professionals struggle with, is finding that confidence, that voice to be able to say, I recognize mentorship is important. I think that you are someone who has something to offer me. And oftentimes the people that we're approaching tend to be accomplished individuals. They're very busy. And so we don't want to be another burden onto that individual. And so having a very clear sense of what it is you are asking for, if it's a monthly check-in, being able to just say that, you know, I oftentimes, before I approach someone, I practice that conversation with another colleague or a friend, just to try and put me at ease with it so that I didn't feel as awkward. So I would say practice the interaction before it happens. And then another one is just being very clear about what you're hoping to get from that, that relationship, and being able to articulate that during that conversation. And that first conversation may not be where you make the ask. That first conversation might be truly getting to know you if this is someone that you don't have a relationship with previously, And then maybe at a subsequent interaction, you can broach the topic of perhaps serving as a formal mentor or establishing a mentoring relationship.
That's perfect advice. Thank you so much. So let's turn our attention to Rameen. So Rameen, earlier in your intro, you were talking about how you very much view yourself as a generalist, but you have this huge portfolio, which has shifted over time. And it sounds like recently your office is taking on some additional areas. Could you talk with us about sort of managing that tension between generalists and being a specialist, meaning that as higher ed evolves, it seems like there are areas of knowledge which are very specialized, and how you as a supervisor, as a leader, how do you take that on? How do you feel comfortable taking on those additional responsibilities?
Great. Thank you, Tracy. You know, I think, first of all, I think it's a natural progression to start as a very structured, you know, new entry-level person that's focusing in on an area and kind of being a little bit of the mini expert and maybe even evolving into an expert in your area. And then over time, as you get maybe opportunity to grow and expand your own portfolio of maybe who you work with, maybe you're supervising more people, maybe you're taking on different units or just doing something completely different, you're expanding, you're kind of growing, and you're getting into a kind of a larger sphere where you're maybe becoming a little bit more of a generalist. You know, I know people that have been lifers that stay, you know, in one field, residence life through their entire life. But even so, they may end up in a position where they're now reporting to different people, having to respond to different people related to people that want their resources or this or that, and there's a different realm of responsibility. So I think it's natural, first of all, just to progress into kind of being a little bit more generalist as you kind of expand up or out. But I think with that, you know, it certainly takes some nuance. I think you as a generalist, if you're working with a lot of people that are experts and are great, really individuals and talented people at what they do, you have to really demonstrate great flexibility, first of all. You should not be really carrying yourself with much ego. It's okay to not be the smartest one in the room when it comes to something, and be okay with that. I think what it allows you to do is shift a little bit. I think you should always be a good learner. So if I'm taking on a responsibility or a supervision or a new office in my area, I'm going to try to learn as much as I can. I'm going to do the homework. I'm going to read. If there's articles in the Chronicle or articles by my colleagues, I will take the time to read it and prep myself as much as I can without really maybe necessarily knowing all the logistics and the weeds of the role. I think you need to ask good questions, asking good questions. So hopefully that's something that we all can do. We all can understand things, maybe ask for clarification. I think probably that one of the biggest challenge when you're working with experts is they're so embedded maybe in what their area of expertise is. They don't have as good of an understanding, or perhaps they don't have that understanding of what you might be dealing with in the broader sense, or you're having to deal with a vice chancellor that wants this and that, or a chancellor that wants to push an initiative. And how do you transfer that to somebody who's very guarded about what they do and how important it is that they do? I think you can do some intentional things. I know for me, I have a management group that I have all my directors in. Now, you can imagine it used to be a smaller number. Now it's 16 people in excess of that. That's not a nimble group. It's not a group that's really going to make decisions really quickly because they are 16 diverse, unique, talented experts. But what it does is it allows them to hear from others, to understand and appreciate the challenges that are going on, whether it's in a resource center or a student life dynamic or a protest dynamic or whatever it might be. And it allows people to kind of learn and to grow and to see, oh, well, you know, I'm so much into my own thing that I didn't realize, or now I have a greater appreciation of what my dreamer students are going through, or what my students are dealing with when it comes to basic needs, because they're hearing it from a director who's specializing in that area. So I think you can structure as a leader of a larger unit, for instance, or as a generalist, those kinds of opportunities to have staff appreciate and understand by learning from one another. And I think it allows them to see some flexibility in that way. So I think there's always great challenges, but I think as a generalist, I love the opportunity. And I'm very serious about it, even and intentional when I go to professional development conferences, for instance. I will intentionally, if let's say I didn't have any experience with veterans and now I'm overseeing Veteran Services Center, I'm going to go at NASPA or ACPA or whatever conference you go to, and I'm going to seek out those sessions and I'm going to learn from the experts across the country. And you're not going to absorb everything, but it gives you the opportunity to understand, have a greater appreciation of the challenges, understand the language a little bit. And then when you walk into the room with your staff member, you can at least come with a baseline of information of being informed. But I don't try to micromanage, and I don't try to know everything that my staff knows. That's impossible to do in this day and age, especially as you expand and grow maybe a staff that you work with.
Rameen, I love how you're describing yourself as this lifelong learner and how that connects with your professional development. But I'm also channeling Bridget earlier about, you know, taking on new things and some of the ambiguity that goes with it. So Rameen, I'm wondering if there was ever an instance where you were asked or encouraged to take on a new role or overseeing a new area that gave you pause and made you think, oh, you know, can I do this? Or, you know, is this going to be too hard? Has there ever been that moment?
I think all the time. I mean, it literally, you know, student government, student media. I mentioned I did a little bit of advising with that, you know, years ago, and I work with our student government through all the institutions I've been at. But, you know, our operation, they manage the Anteater Express, which is basically our campus shuttle system. I know nothing about that. You know, I really don't. And I have not wanted to know anything about that. Now I'm going to learn. But I think, you know, it can be daunting. It certainly can be overwhelming in that sense. And I think, you know, if you have people that you can go to that you trust, certainly the person that was in charge or overseeing that area is still on our campus. So I'm going to utilize them. I'm not going to be shy about it, to utilize their knowledge and their background. And of course, the people that are in those roles. So I use that as a quick example. But I think it, you know, it can be daunting. And I think we all have to overcome our fears. You know, I stayed regionally in Southern California. Now, I've gotten experiences at different campuses that I'm very proud of, but, you know, I haven't been working in Texas or Illinois. And I think it would probably have broadened me even further to have better understanding of different ways you can do things, different ways to approach problems, different, you know, ways to address things. And so I think you really have to be a learner if you're going to be in education to begin with. I feel like, you know, that's like a baseline. And I think, you know, and all our experiences can help to kind of grow us and develop us and the diversity of experiences that exist out there. So.
Great, thank you. Nicely said. I have a couple of questions, more questions, and if we have time, we'll take some questions from participants as well. So I want to focus on leadership. So I know it would come as no surprise to any of you to hear me say that, you know, the higher ed landscape is a little volatile. There's a lot going on and things change very quickly. I'm interested in hearing you talk about your leadership style, you know, how you respond as a leader when things are happening very quickly. And one example is just what happened this spring with campuses being asked to respond very quickly, oftentimes having to close or shift instructional modality or student support modality online as COVID was emerging. So I'd love to hear those thoughts. Let's start with Casey, if that's okay.
Sure, thanks, Tracy. Great question. Certainly relevant given the day and age that we're living in right now. I'll just start off by just giving a general overview of my own leadership style or the kind of the way that I like to approach leadership. So I'm one that believes that leadership is very relational, and I take tremendous pride in establishing meaningful relationships with those with whom I work at all levels of my organization. That's really important. I try to role model the type of behavior and attitude, disposition that I expect of my staff. And in that vein, I roll up my sleeves. I work alongside my staff. People that work with me can attest to this. There's no task that I think is too small or mundane. If my staff, if it needs to get done, I'm there with my staff to make sure it gets done. And I'm very process oriented. Process matters. I like to ensure that I empower my staff to make decisions, and that when I'm making decisions that impact not only our division, but ultimately our student experience, that I invite the voices of those that are going to have to live with that decision and whose daily experiences are going to be shaped by that decision. So that's just kind of my default leadership approach and setting. COVID-19 has challenged that in a lot of ways. I mentioned the tremendous value that I place on relationship building engaging with my colleagues, oftentimes in person. That has been incredibly challenging since March. Most of my staff, we had a division meeting in May, and we did it virtually. It was the first time that we had a virtual divisional meeting, and it certainly was challenging. That was probably one of the most difficult things that I've done over the course of the last 4 months, is try and find meaningful ways to connect with my staff, given that I'm not proximate to them. I'm not in the same room with them. Communication is very important, when leading a multifaceted organization. And it becomes even more important in a time of crisis, particularly like the one we're experiencing right now. And so I've had to be very intentional about the frequency with which I communicate, and just communicating at every turn that I get. That in this particular moment, there's no such thing as over communication, is what I'm finding with my staff. My staff want to know what's going on in our campus. They want to understand how decisions are being made. And the decision-making process right now is complicated because normally I create space for input, I invite ideas, and we work through those until we reach consensus. That's incredibly difficult to do right now in a landscape where things are changing so quickly, and a lot of our decision-making right now is happening top-down. And so I find myself spending more time trying to create buy-in to decisions that have already been made, as opposed to inviting input so that we can collectively make a decision. And it's really helped me understand, at least in this moment, the importance of explaining why we are doing things, not only for our students, but not only for our staff, but especially for our students. I think that has been a key lesson that I've learned over the course of this crisis, is that I've have to reorient myself to lead with the why. When I'm announcing new initiatives, when I'm explaining decisions that have been made, I need to start by explaining why, in order to create that sense of buy-in and ultimately that sense of ownership amongst my team.
Casey, I loved what you just said about how in a crisis situation you've had to reorient, right? So you haven't been able to always get input in the same way that you have liked traditionally. Right. But what you said about getting buy-in is so important, because these are still stakeholders, they're members of your community. And those relationships matter. They will persist beyond this urgency and this emergency. So I love the way that you characterize that. Thank you. Thank you. I'd love to hear from Bridget.
Well, first, I just want to say thank you, Casey. I really appreciated hearing your perspectives on this question. I think my leadership style, I would describe maybe in 2 ways. First is collaboration. I really take a collaborative approach to my work, and that is similar to being relational, building partnerships across campus and building relationships, and then coaching. I really take a coaching approach to my team. I do a lot of my work through my team and try to utilize their talents and try to utilize their interests and their areas of growth. I like to tease our general counsel's office, because I run a compliance program where we oversee civil rights laws and implementation on campus. I like to tease that I supervise almost as many lawyers and JDs as she does. And those individuals bring a very different perspective to their work in higher education. And so I've had to learn how to adapt my coaching style and my leadership style to meet their needs. I think at the end of the day, what I bring to, as a leader, what I bring to the table is the ability to translate across campus populations. I've worked with faculty, I've worked with students, I've worked with staff. And so I can kind of be responsive in different environments to those populations and help my team understand the perspectives of those populations as we're doing our work. And certainly COVID has been incredibly disorienting. I have a 20-month-old, and she is not a quiet 20-month-old. So to do my work, which often involves supporting individuals who have experienced perhaps some form of trauma, that's been difficult to manage just personally, and then trying to support my team who are also managing their lives, their children, their specific circumstances. So during this time, the pandemic started, and then the Department of Education also issued a final rule under Title IX. So I'm currently trying to implement in an incredibly short time frame over a summer quarter a new law that influences a very important policy on our campus. And then, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement and the conversation around race relations in America plays my office plays an important part of those conversations in supporting our community. So all of this is happening while we're in a remote environment. So your ability to be relational on Zoom can feel really limited. So I've tried to really make sure that I've been available to individuals and in whatever space feels comfortable to them, whether it's phone calls, Zoom, you know, and look forward to being able to reconvene on campus because I do think that there's an important element of being in person for me to really feel effective in my role.
Thank you, Bridget. And also thank you for reminding us that we're not all just leaders, that we have multiple identities, and working from home surfaces a lot of that. You know, some of the challenges we have with balancing our multiple demands with elder care or child care, in addition to our leadership role. So thank you for reminding us of that. Rameen, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, you know, I think my colleagues have really spoken well to this. I will share the biggest challenge is information. We all want it. And we don't know if it's accurate information. The information's changing all the time. So then decisions are changing all the time, and it's frustrating. It's frustrating. So I think the way in which I've been really reinforcing as much as I can is maximum flexibility. This is a time, and it's hard because some people, you know, it's not their natural inclination is they need structure. And this is a very unstructured environment. So I think, you know, really maximizing on flexibility, being able to pivot, you know, understanding fatigue when it's existing. It certainly exists with me. And if it's existing with me, and I'm a pretty energized person usually, I know it's existing with my staff team as well. So being sensitive about that and understanding about that, I think really being open to feedback. You know, I think early on, I thought I was communicating a lot. I was sending messages at left and right, and my staff wanted more. So I said, okay, I'm going to keep it coming. I'm going to give you everything. And sometimes that can be overwhelming, though. I've had some staff say, I can't read another long-winded message from the campus about the structures that I need to do if I want to come back on campus, hybrid mode, and, you know, and being able to have them vent it out and hear it. And I think the last thing is we all have to model the behavior sometimes. And because I know that people are looking at me, and if I'm coming in with just, you know, sour face, and it's okay to be human, and it's okay to be authentic and share. I'm frustrated about something, like we all were when we were seeing, you know, what was happening, what happened to George Floyd and what was going on. You know, it's okay to be honest and open about this makes me upset. This makes me angry, for instance, and then having those vulnerable moments with staff to share. But generally, I'd say, you know, just trying to be sensitive about that in yourself, because there are a lot of people looking at you for leadership. And if you're coming in, you know, not happy about a decision or whatever, well, you know, your staff's not going to be happy about it either right off the bat. And ultimately, some of us, we have to execute those things. And sometimes the way which we think it should be, and sometimes maybe not necessarily our best way of doing it, but someone else's best way of doing it. And so we have to kind of navigate that nuance.
Thank you, Rameen. A really good reminder about modeling leadership. But you also brought up a good point, and Bridget did as well, that are working now mostly online. I know Casey's on campus, but many of us are still working remotely. I feel has made it difficult for me to engage and support our Black students and our Black colleagues around racial justice issues. And there is a lot of anger, there's a lot of frustration. And I feel like sometimes connecting digitally, even on the phone or through Zoom, has not been sufficient, has not been the same as really being able to gather and have those hard conversations and to talk about fighting racism and to fighting these structures of oppression. So I just want to note that I think that for many leaders, that is an additional frustration, that this is such an important time, this moment, and that support is needed and leadership is needed, but it sometimes can't happen in person, and that has been difficult. Does anybody want to add anything to that? I have two really great questions from participants, and so I'm going to pose the first one. Love to hear from any of you three on the first question. So the question is, in this tenuous financial and political environment, how do you demonstrate or communicate our necessity to supporting a successful experience for all students? And the question is really around shrinking resources and fearing that some people will see student support areas as less central to the institutional mission and expendable. Any thoughts on that?
I'll go first and welcome my colleagues. I think that's such an important question. And I know the commitment that I made to my office and my team was that our student-facing programs, our student support programs, would be the last budgets that I would touch. So I am expected as a leader to meet budget targets, and we have a $220 million deficit at the University of Chicago. I know most universities are facing deficits. And so that was my commitment out of the gate, was that, those were the budgets that would be last impacted. And so I think the commitment of leadership, your budget indicates your priority. And so what you do in these times and the decisions that you make is really important. And I would offer for consideration to all leaders that they think about how they approach any reductions in staffing, in programs, and really think from an equity framework and from a student support framework to ensure that there's a lot of consideration as to how they meet those budget targets. It's really hard to balance having to reduce your budget and working within those principles.
Thank you, Bridget.
So I would echo Bridget's sentiments. I think our campus also went through a budget reduction exercise, and I put forth a similar challenge or commitment across our division that we were going to do our best to preserve student-facing programs and services. And I'm proud to say that we were able to accomplish our budget targets without impacting any student services. I happen to be at SMU, obviously, and we are a very tuition-dependent institution. So 74% of our annual operating budget is funded by tuition. And so we are enrollment dependent. And I've been able to successfully, thus far, knock on wood, really impress upon my colleagues across the university the importance at this moment, more so than in any other time, of student support services. I mean, our students are under tremendous amounts of stress. This transition from in-person learning to online learning has been difficult for many to manage. It has highlighted inequities that exist amongst our student communities. And a lot of our student support services and programs are best suited to directly respond and meet the needs of our students where they are and ensure that they're able to access the resources needed to be successful and to continue as students at SMU. And so while it might seem very easy to look at student support services as the first place to make reductions or to cut, I would argue that's a very short-sighted view, that if we are truly committed as institutions to the academic success and retention of our students, then we must continue to invest in the services that support their success. And thus far, that has been a winning argument on our campus, and I hope that that continues.
Thank you. Rameen, anything to add?
I think I never stop making sure that I communicate the value of the work of my offices and making sure people understand it. Because when you deal with faculty and you deal with staff at a large Research One university, which we are at UC Irvine, there are a lot of people that don't know what we do. There are a lot of people that don't understand what we do, don't value what we do. So it's constantly an issue in terms of education and really trying to educate people in whatever settings I'm in about the value of the work that's being done and having people understand and or have a better appreciation of what we're doing. So I think that has to always continue. And now more than ever, just, similarly, because everyone's like, well, what do you do now? And what do you do over here? What are you doing over there? And so, being upfront, if we have some offices that are pretty slow right now. and saying, okay, maybe some of our staff can help out in other areas that are, you know, that dealing with a lot right now, maybe, for instance. And so, you know, being strategic about, you know, your staffing in that way. We've had a soft freeze on a few positions right now, and that's campus-wide. And those are positions that I've articulated that we should unfreeze, but I'm also understanding, okay, people want to take a break and hold for a second, and we'll regroup in September, October. And I can't argue with that. I mean, that seems responsible in some respects. But we have not gone through any necessarily a budget cut scenario right now. I'm prepared for it, to look at it in terms of equity across, or figuring out what we need to do. But I would echo what has already been said, that my call would be to say, look, we are the proactive group out there that can connect with students to make sure they feel connected and sense of belonging, know that they matter. And we're the ones that are going to try and help them from cycling out and or not being retained and or kind of devolving in terms of their own capacity to, you know, to navigate the pressures that exist. And so we're trying to be proactive. I mean, certainly that's not to say counseling center is not important, and some of our other emergency services, those are absolutely important. But I say, if you invest more into what we do on the proactive realm with our students, then I think you'll see a benefit over the long haul. And that sometimes is hard to articulate to people because they want to see that, you know, they need to know. But, you know, we see it when students graduate. We see it in our Rossier graduation. We see it in some other spaces where we can say, these are testimonies to the connection that we've made and the brilliance of our staff that are working with our students in these ways. So, you know, I think it's constant education. It's sometimes frustrating because you'll hear the same, you know, faculty members saying something that's, you know, not educated about what we do. But I think right now we are in a good place too right now. Fortunately, I knock on that table right now, but hopefully, you know, we all can come out of this budget situation, hopefully not too harmed.
Yeah, I think during this time, student affairs and student services are more important than ever in supporting students. Thank you. Here's another question from participants. Do you have any recommendations as to how to shift supervisors or colleagues' behavior from transactional to more relational? So how do you shift a supervisor or colleagues' behavior from transactional to more relational? Any advice on that? Oh, I don't want to put on my teacher hat and call on you.
Well, I'll start. And oh, go ahead, Rameen. Go ahead, Rameen.
Oh, you're gonna put me out there first, huh? Okay. No, I mean, so we're all complicated, unique individuals. And so we all have strengths, and sometimes those strengths can be our weaknesses at times. So I mean, I would want to obviously learn more about what the situation is, what's the context of it. But, you know, certainly there are sometimes folks that they're rigid in a certain way in which they interact or whatever, and they need to understand the ways in which they affect others in your organization, especially if they're having a detrimental effect. Or maybe you just need them to kind of show their other side a little bit more. And so that does take coaching. It sometimes takes, you know, time. You know, there may be subtle ways to do that through trainings, you know, offering trainings to the individual to say, you know, hey, this would be great for you to attend. This will help broaden your scope, you know, and it's showing that you're investing in them, but you also have your alternative motive of you're hoping that they can stretch and grow in a certain way relationally, perhaps. So, I mean, those are some strategies. I mean, it's so hard. You know, we do deal with it a lot, and it can be on both sides. You can have some great relational people that don't know how to turn in a form, you know, and that grows on people after a while too. And it's like, okay, wait a minute, this is just a basic thing I need you to do. Turn in a timesheet so you can get paid. So, you know, there's those kinds of ways in which it can turn as well. But I think, you know, those are some of the ways in which I would probably look at it in that context. But Casey will have a better answer, I'm sure.
Thank you, Rameen.
Thanks for the setup, Rameen. You know, again, I think to Rameen's point, I mean, certainly context matters. And so I certainly want to make sure that I had a better understanding of the context that this participant is in. But in my experience, I found that my sense is that most supervisors want to meet the needs of their employees and strive to support their employees the best that they can. And so I'd like to believe that, again, this is one of those instances where articulating a desire for a more relational type of environment or experience could be beneficial. I think that a supervisor may not understand that their employees are seeking a deeper or more meaningful relationship with them and with their colleagues. And so I think being able to express that desire in an appropriate way is important. Offering suggestions as to how to create some of those relational experiences. For some people, I've had experiences where some of my staff teams have really close relationships. They hang out together outside of work. And it usually is, one or two individuals who are really high relational individuals that take it upon themselves to organize those activities and then invite people to participate in them. And so those might be some strategies that I'd offer in this instance. Number one, making sure that supervisor understands that there's a desire amongst the team for deeper and more meaningful relationships. And then, offering to organize and invite the team to partake in some of those activities.
Thank you. Bridget, anything to add?
I really like both of those suggestions, so I won't be redundant. I agree with the process of giving and receiving feedback and trying to create a culture where you can openly talk about your experiences. I also think it's important to recognize sometimes we have bad bosses and that can really be impactful to someone's experience. And so knowing where your resources are within the workplace, where you can find support, and really thinking about what you want to consider. If that person is not open to receiving the feedback, or the change that you're hoping for isn't coming fast enough, then I know I've left positions because it just wasn't a good fit, and you would hope that's not an outcome, but certainly it's probably one of the most difficult positions to be in when you're having a negative experience in the workplace. Is a very difficult place to be. So I wish our participant the best, and certainly would avail myself offline for any further conversation about how to navigate that.
Thank you, Bridget. That's a very nice offer. We're going to take one last question from participants before we end. Because you've been very generous with your time. And that question is actually very interesting. So what I would say is that universities have built this huge capacity that was previously untapped related to online education and also communication and community building. But the question from our participant is really, any thoughts that you might have about how we can begin to apply this newfound knowledge and online and distance education to student engagement and student support services. Because I would say, I'm highly interested in this area. I don't see the relative growth in student development, professional development programming online historically, as we have put into the pedagogies around traditional teaching, classroom teaching. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. This is an emerging area. If you have ideas, if you've seen things of what campuses are doing, please share.
I'll just go real quickly. I think there's a few things. One is, I think, access. So, we could be in a conference in Tennessee, but we can get online and talk to students now, or talk to staff for that matter, and be accessible. Our chancellor can do the same, or our vice chancellors. So I think that's a great opportunity for access to individuals that maybe students want to hear from. Again, that's a little bit more just kind of in a town hall type of setting. But again, I think that's an opportunity. I think it's an opportunity from the staffing perspective to help boost morale sometimes for those that, let's say, are commuting long distances, or just have, it would be nice for them to take 1 day out of the week or 2 days out of the week and work from home. I think a few months back, that would have been kind of shrugged upon and kind of not, accepted as much. Whereas now I think everyone has a better understanding. You can get work done, and you can be efficient, and you can get things done, and you can do it remotely. And so that's an opportunity perhaps that we can evolve with. And I think also just in terms of a high touch with different students, my Center for Black Cultures and Resources and Research director said, initially there was a little boost from different faces that wouldn't necessarily come to the center physically. And there's a cohort of people in the center that know each other and get along well and are right there. But he was actually getting tapped into with students that he had not known before, not necessarily interface physically with the center, but now online, they're willing to engage with him, and he's developing and cultivating a relationship now in that way. And even with our peer advisors, I think our peer advisors could do things like, hey, you know, our numbers for Black students at UCR are not that strong. And so we want to make sure that their experience is hopefully a high touch one and they're feeling like they're being supported. So maybe we divide out and, okay, our peer educators can have 10, 15 students that they know that they can reach out to on a one-on-one basis to say, hey, I'm here, I want to be a mentor to you, or let's interact in this way. Whereas maybe that's harder in a physical space sometimes to draw, you know, 800 people in or something like that. So I think there's opportunities. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Any other thoughts?
I would just offer that we on our campus have experienced similar kind of phenomenon that Rameen just described, in that we are seeing a different type of student engaged with our programs and services that are being offered online relative to the in-person offerings. And so this experience is definitely, obviously, we've made tremendous investments in technology in our academic spaces as well as our administrative spaces. And we plan to continue to use those technologies to engage a broader array of our students. It's also been wonderful for us to, as a new way to engage parents and stakeholders, you know, during the course of COVID-19 and our planning and response efforts. I shared earlier, we've been intentional about being as communicative as possible. We've hosted a number of town hall forums, which prior to this, we didn't do much of. And the response to that has been overwhelmingly positive. And I think it's challenged us to think about going forward, how we incorporate some of those practices into our business operations going forward. And I think that's going to ultimately benefit not only our students, but our families going forward. You know, I think we will continue to be more mindful about access in terms of technology, making sure that our students, that's one of the things that we rolled out very quickly here, was an emergency support program for students to be able to borrow laptops, mobile devices, hotspots from the university. And, you know, the demand and need for those things, I think, surprised many of us on campus. And now that we know that our students struggle with some of those items, I think we have an obligation to continue to provide those things. And I think that will ultimately benefit our students. And again, increase access to our various support services. So those are some of the things that I'm fairly confident will continue well beyond COVID-19.
Excellent, thank you. Bridget, anything quick to add?
No, I agree with especially the sentiment of being able to continue some remote work in the future. I do think that especially for staff that do really intensive work, my staff work with a lot of individuals who've experienced trauma. I think that's a way to give them some space and reprieve and still allow them to do their work effectively. So I'm really hopeful that my employer will also support that continued option.
Thank you, Bridget. And thank you to all three of you. I honestly could not have found a better way to spend an hour with you three than with you three this Friday afternoon. I want to thank Bridget Collier, Mmeje, and Rameen Talesh so much for spending time with us. You've been fantastic in your comments and your advice. And I'm going to turn it over to Australia, who's going to wrap up this online session.
Thank you, Tracy. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists and moderator for providing valuable insight into their career journeys. As I mentioned earlier, a recording of today's webinar will be sent out in the next few days. When you close out of today's webinar, a short survey will appear. Please take a moment to provide feedback on today's webinar and share your ideas for future virtual programs. Don't forget to tag us on social media using the hashtag Rossier Leads. Thank you for attending. We hope you will attend future Leadership Month sessions. Have a great day and fight on.